A narrow beam of golden light stretched across the meticulously groomed hedges of Willow Creek, a high-end suburban neighborhood. The tranquil evening air was alive with the gentle hum of laughter and conversations drifting from the backyard of an elegant home. Strings of soft lights twinkled overhead, illuminating a gathering filled with love, hope, and celebration. This was no ordinary evening. It was the wedding of Sophia Carter and James Walker, a couple admired not only for their devotion to each other but for their accomplishments. Sophia, a distinguished judge with an unwavering commitment to fairness, looked breathtaking in her flowing ivory gown, her radiant smile reflecting the joy of the moment. Beside her stood James, her husband and a senior agent with the National Investigative Bureau, NIB. He exuded calm confidence, his arm wrapped protectively around Sophia's shoulders as he gazed at her with evident adoration. Their home, a symbol of the life they had built together, served as the venue for this intimate celebration. James had spent countless evenings ensuring the backyard was a welcoming haven for their loved ones. String lights sparkled above the lush garden, and the scent of carefully arranged lilies and roses perfumed the air. Guests mingled freely, sharing laughter and heartfelt stories. Sophia's parents beamed with pride as they spoke of her accomplishments, recalling childhood memories with fondness. James's family, many of whom had traveled long distances, shared toasts filled with well-wishes for the couple's bright future. Soft music played in the background, blending harmoniously with the sound of children's laughter as they dashed across the yard. Unbeknownst to the cheerful gathering, only a few houses away, a pair of watchful eyes glared from behind lace curtains. Ethel Grayson, a longtime resident of Willow Creek, was infamous for her sharp tongue and habitual meddling. This evening, she watched the lively scene with disapproval etched deeply into her wrinkled face. To her, the presence of certain guests, those she deemed out of place, ignited an old, bitter prejudice she kept well hidden from neighbors. Muttering to herself, Ethel reached for her phone. Her fingers, gnarled but steady, dialed the familiar number of the local police precinct. With a shrill, accusing tone, she described an exaggerated tale of rowdy noise and suspicious behavior emanating from the Carter Walker residence. She laced her words with veiled implications, hinting at illicit activities. By the time she ended the call, she had spun a story that bore no resemblance to the joyful celebration unfolding a few houses away. At the police station, the dispatcher relayed the complaint. The officers who had been enduring a quiet shift exchanged intrigued glances. A reported disturbance in Willow Creek, a neighborhood known for its tranquility, was unusual enough to pique their interest. Within minutes, a team of officers set out, their demeanor already sharpened by assumptions as they approached the scene. Back at the party, the atmosphere remained lighthearted and carefree. Sophia engaged in an animated conversation with her childhood best friend, their laughter ringing across the yard. James, meanwhile, shared a chuckle with his uncle as they discussed plans for an upcoming family gathering. Children darted around, giggling and chasing one another, their energy a delightful counterpoint to the adults' relaxed chatter. Glasses clinked in celebration as toasts were made, and the gathering felt wrapped in a cocoon of love and happiness. As the sky transitioned from a vibrant orange to deep hues of pink and purple, the party remained unaware of the looming disruption. Beyond the garden's edges, the soft rumble of approaching cars and the faint flicker of blue lights hinted at a brewing storm. The joy that filled the air would soon be overshadowed by a confrontation that would test not only Sophia and James's resolve, but the very principles they stood for. Under the warm glow of string lights, Sophia and James swayed to the rhythm of their favorite song. The dance was intimate and joyful, a perfect reflection of their bond. Friends and family surrounded them, clapping in time with the music, their faces lit with admiration and happiness. It was a fleeting but perfect moment, a snapshot of love and unity, unmarred by the outside world. Yet just beyond the neatly trimmed hedges of their backyard in Willow Creek, the harmony of the evening was being quietly disrupted. Headlights sliced through the growing twilight, accompanied by the low rumble of engines. Several police cars came to a stop outside the property, their doors opening in unison. Officers stepped out, adjusting their belts and exchanging clipped words as they prepared to enter. Their scanning eyes betrayed no acknowledgement of the joyous celebration within. The first hint of trouble came when a young guest caught sight of the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the house's large windows. Confusion turned to concern as murmurs spread among the attendees. Slowly, more guests noticed the line of squad cars parked outside. The celebratory air began to shift, unease rippling through the crowd. James noticed the change almost immediately. He gently placed a reassuring hand on Sophia's shoulder and guided her toward the source of the disturbance. His expression, once filled with happiness, had turned serious. "What's going on?" Sophia asked, her brow furrowing in concern as her gaze fell on the approaching officers. James squeezed her hand, his voice steady but tinged with unease. "Stay calm," he said softly, though a knot of worry was already forming in his chest. He could see the determined looks on the officers' faces as they strode toward the backyard, their hands resting ominously on their holsters. The lead officer, a tall man with a steely expression, stepped forward and called out, his voice cutting through the soft hum of conversation. "We've received reports of a disturbance. Everyone needs to stay where they are." Sophia and James exchanged a brief, knowing glance. Without speaking, they agreed to stay composed. Sophia, ever the professional, took a step forward to address the officers directly. "Good evening, officers," she began, her voice calm and measured. "This is a private event, our wedding, in fact. Is there some kind of misunderstanding?" The officer's gaze swept over the gathering before settling on Sophia. His expression didn't soften. "We've received reports of suspicious activity and a noise complaint," he replied gruffly. "We're going to need to investigate." James felt his stomach tighten. He recognized the officer's tone, dismissive and unyielding, the kind that invited no explanations. Despite his growing frustration, he kept his voice steady. "Officer, I assure you this is just a wedding celebration," James said. "We'd be happy to answer any questions, but there's no need for concern here." The officer didn't respond directly. Instead, he motioned to his colleagues, who began spreading out among the guests. Their movements were authoritative, their presence unnerving. What had started as mild confusion among the attendees quickly turned to discomfort as the festive atmosphere had dissolved entirely, leaving behind an oppressive silence that hung over the gathering like a storm cloud. Guests exchanged uneasy glances as the police's stern expressions and dismissive behavior became more apparent. Every question they asked was tinged with skepticism, their inquiries less about understanding and more about finding fault. Sophia and James stood together, watching the scene unfold, their hands tightly clasped as if drawing strength from each other. Sophia, ever calm under pressure, stepped forward. Her voice, though measured, carried the firm authority she had honed in the courtroom. "Excuse me, officer," she said, addressing the lead officer who had taken charge. "I understand you're responding to a report, but I assure you, this is a private event. We have all the necessary permits, and we are not violating any ordinances." The officer turned to face her, his skeptical gaze sweeping over her. His expression betrayed annoyance, and his tone was curt. "We'll be the judge of that, ma'am," he said, taking a step closer, his hand resting purposefully on his belt. "We need to conduct our investigation, so I suggest you cooperate." James moved to stand beside her, his demeanor controlled but resolute. "Officer, my wife is a judge," he said, his voice steady and deliberate. "We're both very familiar with the law, and we know our rights. There's no need for this level of scrutiny." The officer's eyes flicked toward James, a faint, disdainful smirk tugging at his lips. "A judge? Huh?" he muttered dismissively. "Well, that doesn't change the fact that we received reports of possible illegal activities. We're going to check things out." Hearing the exchange, James's younger brother, Eric, a seasoned attorney, stepped forward. "I'm a lawyer," he interjected, his voice calm but assertive. "Everything here is in order. If you need documentation, we'd be happy to provide it." The officer didn't even look at him. Instead, he waved his hand dismissively and barked, "Step back. We don't need any help from you." The message was clear. The officers weren't here to listen or cooperate. They were here to assert their authority. Any explanation or legal expertise offered by the guests was met with indifference or outright hostility. As the officers began questioning the guests more aggressively, their words carried a tone of accusation. One elderly guest tried to explain, his voice trembling, "This is just a wedding, officers. Nothing suspicious here." "We'll see about that," the lead officer snapped, his tone cold and dismissive. Sophia's father, noticing the rising tension, approached cautiously. "Officers, please, there's no need for this," he said, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "We're law-abiding citizens. There's nothing here to warrant." "Step back," the officer barked, cutting him off mid-sentence. "We'll decide what warrants our attention." Nearby, James noticed one of the officers patting down a teenage boy who had attended with his family. The boy, no older than 14, stood frozen with fear, his hands raised as the officer roughly searched him. The sight made James's chest tighten with anger. "Is this really necessary?" James called out, his voice rising slightly. "That's a child. He's done nothing wrong." The officer ignored him, continuing the search with a roughness that made the boy flinch. Sophia felt her frustration grow as she observed the officer's behavior. It was as though they were deliberately targeting the most vulnerable among the group, the youngest and the elderly, to assert dominance and intimidate the gathering as a whole. "Officer," she called out again, her voice sharper this time, "what you're doing is out of line. These are guests at a wedding, not suspects in a crime." Her words fell on deaf ears. The lead officer shot her a cold glance and stepped closer, his tone low and menacing. "Ma'am, I'd advise you to stop interfering, unless you want to be the next one we take in." The tension in the backyard was palpable, each guest feeling the weight of the officer's unrelenting hostility. James reached out, placing a steadying hand on Sophia's arm. "Not like this," he whispered, his voice firm but quiet. "We need to stay calm." Sophia nodded, but her mind raced. It was clear now. This was no misunderstanding. The officers were intent on finding fault where none existed. What should have been a joyous celebration was turning into a scene of baseless accusations and escalating fear. As the couple stood side by side, their resolve hardened. They had weathered challenges before, but this was different. This was a direct challenge to their dignity, their rights, and their principles. They knew the night was far from over, and what lay ahead would test their strength in ways they had never imagined. Sophia stepped back slightly, her jaw clenched in resolve. "I'm not interfering," she said, her voice measured yet unyielding. "I'm exercising my rights and the rights of everyone here to be treated with respect and fairness." The lead officer's eyes narrowed, his tone becoming even more confrontational. "I suggest you start cooperating, ma'am," he said, "or you'll find yourself in the back of a squad car." The aggressive tone wasn't lost on the guests. A few began to speak up in support of Sophia and James. "You can't do this," a man shouted from the crowd, his voice filled with indignation. "They've done nothing wrong. This is harassment," a woman called out, anger evident in her tone. But the officers seemed to feed off the growing protests, their demeanor becoming more rigid and hostile. They began separating guests into smaller groups, their movements methodical and oppressive, as though turning the backyard celebration into the scene of a crime. Others demanded identification from the guests, treating the event as if it were a raid rather than a wedding. James watched in growing distress, a sinking feeling settling in the pit of his stomach. He had faced countless high-pressure situations in his career, but this was different. It wasn't just the misuse of authority. It was the insidious prejudice behind the actions, a silent yet glaring condemnation based on the color of their skin. Nearby, Sophia's mother clutched her daughter's hand, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Sophia, what are we going to do?" Sophia gave her mother's hand a reassuring squeeze. Though her own heart raced with fear and anger, she spoke calmly. "We won't let them intimidate us," she said firmly. "The law is on our side." But even as she spoke, she noticed the smirks on some of the officers' faces. It was as if they relished the discomfort they were causing, their every action a deliberate display of power. Then one officer broke away from the others and began walking purposefully toward the house. The sight sent a chill through Sophia. She stepped forward quickly, intercepting him. "You need a warrant to enter that house," she said sharply, her voice ringing with authority. "You don't have one, so stay where you are." The officer turned to her, his expression a mix of contempt and irritation. "Lady, don't tell me how to do my job," he said dismissively and resumed his approach. Before he could take another step, James stepped into his path, his posture calm but unyielding. "You heard my wife," he said, his voice low and steady. "You don't have the authority to enter our home." The officer's hand moved slightly toward his holster, a subtle yet unmistakable threat. "Step aside," he ordered, his voice sharp. James didn't flinch. He held his ground, his gaze locked on the officer. "Not until you respect our rights," he said evenly. The confrontation caused a ripple of unease among the guests. It was clear now that this was not about enforcing a noise ordinance or investigating a disturbance. The officers had crossed a line, and the situation was spiraling out of control, becoming far more serious than anyone had anticipated. Sophia glanced at James, her resolve matching his. The tension between the officers and the couple felt like a taut wire ready to snap at any moment. What happened next would determine whether the night ended in words or escalated into violence. As Sophia and James stood firm, their courage unwavering, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only their resolve, but also their belief in justice itself. The justice Sophia Carter had dedicated her career to upholding now seemed like a distant dream. The once serene twilight sky, painted in warm hues of gold and purple, had darkened into an oppressive night. The only illumination came from the cold, flashing red and blue lights of the police cars parked in front of the house. The atmosphere in the backyard, which had shifted from joy to anxiety, now brimmed with tangible fear. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. The officers, now numbering over a dozen, seemed less interested in investigating a disturbance and more intent on asserting their dominance. Their hostility was palpable, and their aggressive actions turned what was meant to be a celebration into a tense and chaotic standoff. Guests who had initially attempted to reason with the officers were met with harsh commands and unnecessary force. What had been a peaceful gathering now resembled a battleground. Sophia and James stood at the heart of the turmoil, determined to hold their ground, though the weight of the officers' aggression bore heavily on them. Sophia's status as a judge seemed to provoke, rather than deter, the officers. When she reminded them of the legal boundaries they were crossing, her words were met with scornful glares and even mocking laughter. "Judge or not, you're in no position to give orders," one officer sneered, shoving past her with disdain. The dismissive tone felt like a blade, but Sophia's resolve remained unbroken. She refused to let their intimidation tactics silence her. Near the edge of the yard, a group of guests had been forced to kneel on the ground, their hands placed behind their heads as though they were criminals. Elderly relatives, visibly distraught, were being treated with callous disregard by officers who showed no concern for their frailty. Any semblance of respect or basic decency seemed to have vanished the moment badges were displayed. James stood frozen, watching his loved ones being humiliated and mistreated. The sight of his relatives, some of whom were trembling with fear, stirred a deep fury within him. His training as a senior agent with the National Investigative Bureau had taught him to remain composed in tense situations. But this was different. This wasn't a tactical operation against a dangerous suspect. This was an unwarranted assault on his family. He clenched his fists tightly, his knuckles white, fighting the overwhelming urge to intervene physically. He knew that any sudden movement might escalate the violence. Sophia's voice cut through the tension, firm and unrelenting as she challenged the officer's actions. "This is illegal. You can't detain us without cause." Her words rang out like a beacon of reason amidst the growing chaos, but her defiance only seemed to fuel the officer's hostility further. "Keep talking, and we'll make sure you're the first to go," an officer snapped, his hand hovering dangerously close to the baton strapped to his belt. Nearby, James's attention was drawn to an officer aggressively patting down a teenage boy who had attended the wedding with his parents. The boy, no older than 14, stood trembling as the officer continued his rough and unnecessary search. His hands shook in the air as he tried to hold back tears. "Get your hands off him," James shouted, his voice rising with controlled outrage as he moved toward the officer. His steps were deliberate and swift, but his body language remained restrained. "He's a kid. There's no reason for this." The officer straightened, his expression hardening as he turned to face James. "Back off," he warned, his voice thick with menace, "or you'll find yourself on the ground next." Ignoring the threat, James stepped closer, his tall frame casting a shadow over the officer. His voice was sharp and commanding. "Enough," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're out of line." The tension between James and the officer reached a fever pitch, and it became clear that a confrontation was imminent. Several guests looked on in alarm, holding their breath as the standoff escalated. Before either man could make another move, Sophia placed a hand on James's shoulder. Her touch was firm, yet grounding. "Not like this," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We can't give them an excuse." Reluctantly, James took a step back, his breathing heavy as he forced himself to comply. The officer smirked, a twisted satisfaction flickering across his face at what he perceived as James's retreat. But this wasn't over. The couple's determination was unshaken, even as the hostility in the air thickened. This was no longer about enforcing a noise complaint or investigating a disturbance. The officer's actions had crossed a line, turning into a blatant display of unchecked power. Sophia and James stood resolute, their shared glance communicating a silent promise. They would not back down, no matter how much the situation spiraled. As the tension in the backyard continued to build, it was clear that the events of this night would not be forgotten. Sophia and James were determined to fight, not just for their dignity, but for the rights of everyone present. The officer gave the teenage boy a final shove before stepping away, leaving him visibly shaken but physically unharmed. The incident, however, was a turning point. The guests had seen enough to realize the officers weren't there to de-escalate or resolve the situation peacefully. Tension boiled over as fear gave way to anger, and many could no longer contain their frustration. For some, watching loved ones treated as criminals was unbearable. Voices rose in defiance, demanding answers and justice. "This is wrong," one man shouted, his face flushed with indignation. "We've done nothing to deserve this." Others echoed his sentiments, their cries growing louder. The officers responded to the crowd's resistance with increased aggression. One officer, his face cold and devoid of empathy, drew his baton and approached an elderly woman who was pleading for the release of her grandson. "Ma'am, step back," he barked harshly. When she hesitated, her frail hands trembling as they reached for the boy, the officer raised his baton threateningly. James Walker saw the movement and acted without hesitation. Surging forward, he caught the officer's wrist just before the baton could strike. His voice was low but filled with a dangerous intensity. "You will not touch her," he said. The officer's eyes widened with fury. In the next moment, he shouted loudly, "He assaulted me! Get him down!" The command carried across the backyard like a thunderclap, and chaos erupted. Several officers rushed in, shoving James back. The gathering descended into turmoil as guests tried to intervene, some shouting for the officers to stop, others physically stepping in to protect their loved ones. The police responded swiftly and brutally. James, who had spent his life protecting others as a senior NIB agent, was forced to the ground with unnecessary force. Sophia cried out in horror as her husband, a man she admired for his unwavering sense of justice, was treated like a violent criminal. Sophia tried to push her way through the throng to reach him, but two officers intercepted her, blocking her path with steely expressions. "You're obstructing justice," one officer said coldly. "Step aside." "Justice?" Sophia shot back, her voice sharp with anger. "This isn't justice. This is a violation of our rights." Tears welled up in her eyes, not from fear, but from the sheer outrage and helplessness of the moment. She steeled herself, refusing to show any weakness. She wouldn't let them break her resolve. One officer reached for her arm, but she twisted away, her expression fierce. "Don't you dare touch me," she warned, her tone a razor's edge. For a brief moment, the officer hesitated, taken aback by the fire in her eyes. But the moment passed quickly. They closed in on her, and one officer grabbed her wrist, twisting it roughly behind her back as another pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "You're under arrest," he said flatly, his words echoing with finality. As the cuffs locked around her wrists, Sophia glanced over at James, who was still pinned beneath two officers. The sight of her husband, the man who had always stood as her protector, now struggling against such injustice, tore at her heart. She bit her lip hard to suppress a sob, determined not to let them see her break. The officers weren't finished. They began arresting other guests who dared to speak out, showing no mercy. Even children weren't spared, some being separated from their parents and threatened with detention. The backyard, once a place of celebration, now felt like a battlefield. The air itself seemed thick with dread, choking out any remaining hope of a peaceful resolution. Pinned beneath two officers, James managed to lift his head, his gaze finding Sophia's across the chaos. "Stay strong," he said, his voice strained but resolute. "We'll get through this." Sophia nodded, her expression firm, though her heart was heavy. She tried to convey through her eyes what words couldn't. She wouldn't give up. Not now, not ever. But as the night dragged on, the sounds of struggle and shouted commands echoed across the yard. It became clear they were facing a force that would not relent easily. The celebratory atmosphere of the evening had been completely erased, replaced with fear and outrage. The bride and groom, who should have been basking in the glow of their happiest day, were torn apart and treated like common criminals. Sophia and James remained steadfast, but the weight of the injustice surrounding them grew heavier with every passing moment. The night had turned into a harrowing ordeal, a battle not just for their dignity, but for the fundamental rights they both had spent their lives upholding. Yet the more the guests tried to reason with the officers, the harsher the officers became. Sophia's wrists throbbed from the agonizing angle at which they had been cuffed. The officer who had restrained her had shown no regard for her comfort, twisting her arms unnecessarily before locking the cuffs tightly. As a judge, Sophia was no stranger to the law or to witnessing injustice. But enduring such blatant disregard for her humanity firsthand was an entirely new and harrowing experience. Nearby, James was pinned to the ground by two officers, his once pristine suit now rumpled and smeared with dirt. Despite his position, his voice remained steady and resolute. "You have no grounds to arrest us," he said, his words strained but firm. "We are not resisting, and we have committed no crimes. Release us immediately." One of the officers holding him down sneered and leaned in closer. "You people never think you're in the wrong, do you?" he said, his tone dripping with contempt, the unspoken prejudice in his words painfully clear. Before James could respond, a commotion broke out behind him. A group of guests had gathered together, their voices rising in protest. "Let them go," one man shouted angrily. "This is wrong," another guest cried. The chorus of outrage swelled, emboldened by the collective injustice they were witnessing. Sophia saw the moment as an opportunity and fixed her gaze on the lead officer. Despite the pain in her arms and the rising tension, she spoke out firmly, her voice cutting through the noise. "Officer," she called, her tone sharp with authority. "I demand to address the legality of your actions. You are violating not only our rights, but the law itself. You've conducted searches and arrests here without reasonable cause or a warrant." The lead officer turned to her, his face darkening with irritation as he stepped closer. His cold, unyielding eyes bore into her as he spoke. "Ma'am, this is a police investigation," he said, his tone mocking. "You don't get to dictate how we handle it." He paused to glance at his fellow officers before adding with a sneer, "And just because you're a judge doesn't mean the rules bend for you." Sophia's heart pounded with frustration, but she refused to back down. Despite her restrained hands, she stood as tall as she could, meeting his gaze with unwavering determination. "I'm not asking you to bend the rules," she said firmly. "I'm demanding you follow them. You have no right to detain us, search us, or enter our home without a warrant." The officer's reaction was swift and brutal. "Get her out of here," he snapped, his tone laced with anger. "If she wants to make speeches, she can do it from a cell." Two officers grabbed Sophia roughly by the arms and began dragging her toward one of the waiting squad cars. The sharpness of their grip caused her to stumble, but she quickly regained her footing, her jaw set against the pain. As they pulled her away, Sophia shouted back, her voice fierce and unyielding. "You're only proving our point. This isn't law enforcement, it's abuse of power." The scene was almost too much for James to bear. Watching his wife, the woman he loved and admired, being treated so violently sent a surge of desperation through him. His voice broke as he shouted, "Get your hands off her." The officers responded by pressing James harder into the ground. One of them leaned in close, hissing, "You're not in control here, so stay down." Seeing Sophia dragged away lit a fire in James that he could no longer suppress. He had dedicated his life to upholding the law, but now, in this moment, he was just a man fighting to protect the woman he loved. With a sudden, powerful burst of effort, he tried to push himself free from the officer's grasp. The guests, still gathered in protest, gasped as James's struggle added to the growing chaos. The officers reacted quickly, their actions growing even more forceful as they tried to subdue him. The once celebratory atmosphere of the backyard was now completely unrecognizable. What had been a symbol of love and unity was now a scene of turmoil and pain. For Sophia and James, the fight was no longer just about this night. It was about standing against a system determined to strip them of their dignity and their rights. The echoes of their struggle reverberated across the yard, a stark reminder that this was a battle not easily won. James Walker pushed himself up from the ground, shaking off one officer's grip just enough to scramble onto his knees. The officer who had been holding him down stumbled back, recovering quickly to draw his baton, raising it menacingly. "I said stay down," the officer barked, advancing toward James with intent. As the baton swung downward, James reacted instinctively. He raised his forearm to block the strike, the impact sending a jolt of searing pain through his arm. Still, he held his ground. "Enough of this," he growled, his voice low and charged with controlled fury. "We have the right to defend ourselves." The sight of James rising seemed to enrage the officers further. Several began converging on him, their expressions twisted with determination to subdue him once more. Sophia Carter, watching from the edge of the yard, felt a surge of anger and fear that overpowered the pain in her bound wrists. She could not stand idly by while James faced this brutality. Summoning every ounce of her training and resolve, she shouted over the cacophony, her voice strong and unwavering. "Stop this now," she cried. "You are violating the civil rights of everyone here. This will not go unanswered." Her words cut through the chaos, causing a momentary hesitation among the officers. For a brief instant, silence blanketed the backyard as the weight of her declaration seemed to stun everyone present. But the pause was fleeting. The lead officer quickly regained his composure and barked an order that rippled through his team like a call to arms. "Take them all in," he shouted. "Charge them with obstruction, and whatever else we can find. If they want to fight, we'll give them one to remember." The officers redoubled their efforts with alarming ferocity. Several more guests were seized, their cries of protest drowned out by the officers' commands. Even children were not spared from the chaos, with some being forcibly separated from their parents and led to the side, tears streaming down their small faces. James and Sophia, overwhelmed and outnumbered, were pinned down once again. Their attempts to defend themselves were met with escalating force. As Sophia struggled against the officers holding her, she caught a glimpse of one of her elderly relatives being shoved roughly toward a squad car. Nearby, a young child was being wrenched from his mother's arms, his wails piercing through the night. The sight ignited a deep-seated rage within Sophia. Her voice, carrying both pain and fury, rose above the tumult. "You think you can treat us like this without consequences?" she spat. "We will not be silenced. We will not be intimidated." Her defiance only seemed to provoke the officers further. One of them, in an attempt to silence her, shoved her roughly to the ground. The impact sent a sharp jolt of pain through her shoulder, but Sophia refused to let them see her falter. Gritting her teeth, she struggled to her feet once more, drawing on every ounce of strength to stand tall. The situation had descended beyond anyone's control. What had begun as a joyous celebration of love and unity had been twisted into a harrowing ordeal marked by unchecked brutality and injustice. James and Sophia, once hopeful and jubilant, now found themselves standing against a system determined to break them. But their resolve was unshaken. They knew the fight was no longer about their freedom alone. It had become a battle to expose the abuse of power and to stand up for every person wronged that night. Bloodied but unbowed, the couple stood amidst the chaos, their spirits unbroken. The flashing lights from the squad cars illuminated their determined expressions, while cries of outrage and despair echoed from the guests who bore witness to the horrific scene. As James and Sophia met the cold, unfeeling stares of the officers surrounding them, they knew one thing for certain. They would not give up, no matter the cost. The air around them crackled with tension, heavy with the weight of what had transpired. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming odds, their defiance burned brightly, an unextinguished flame in the darkness of the night. She called out, her words slicing through the chaos. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The lead officer, the one who had orchestrated much of the aggression, stepped forward. His expression was a mix of irritation and smugness. "Lady, I don't care who you think you are," he sneered. "You're under arrest, just like the rest of them." Sophia's eyes blazed with determination as she replied, her voice cutting through the air with a commanding tone. "I am Judge Sophia Carter," she declared. "I've served on the bench for over a decade, and I know the law better than anyone here. What you're doing isn't just illegal, it's a gross violation of our civil rights." Her revelation landed like a thunderclap. For a brief moment, the lead officer's smugness faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He glanced at his colleagues, some of whom exchanged uneasy glances as the weight of Sophia's words began to sink in. Sophia wasn't finished. She turned to James, who had managed to rise to his feet despite the officers still surrounding him. "And this is my husband, James Walker," she continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. "He's not just any citizen. He's a high-ranking agent with the National Investigative Bureau." Her words fell like a stone into a still pond, sending ripples of shock through the crowd. Even the guests, many of whom had known the couple for years, were stunned by the power behind the revelation. The officers, however, were visibly rattled. Some exchanged looks of disbelief, their confidence beginning to waver. A few cast nervous glances toward the squad cars, where several guests remained detained, their phones capturing every moment of the chaos. The lead officer's face darkened, and he snarled, "You think your titles make you untouchable? It doesn't change anything. You're still interfering with an investigation." James's response was calm, but his voice carried an edge that cut through the tension. "You call this an investigation?" he said, his tone dripping with quiet fury. "You showed up here without a warrant, harassed our guests, and used excessive force against unarmed civilians, including children and the elderly. Do you really think this won't come back to haunt you?" His words were like a cold wind cutting through the heated confrontation. Some of the officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado beginning to crack. Sophia seized the moment, pointing to the crowd of guests. "Everything you've done here has been recorded," she said firmly. "Those recordings are already being sent to the media and our legal team. This situation is no longer under your control." The lead officer's face flushed a deep red, his rage barely contained. He took a step closer to Sophia, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper. "You may be a judge, and he may be an agent, but out here, that doesn't mean a damn thing." Sophia held his gaze, unflinching. "We'll see about that," she replied coolly. "Your actions tonight will be reviewed by more than just this department." Her words hung heavily in the air, a stark reminder that the officer's behavior would not go unchecked. The mood in the backyard shifted once again. While the officers still held the physical upper hand, the revelation of James and Sophia's positions, and the knowledge that their misconduct was being documented, had introduced a new dynamic. The battle was far from over, but for the first time that night, the couple's unyielding defiance had made the officers confront the reality of their actions. And though the situation remained tense, the tide was beginning to turn. "There will be an investigation," Sophia Carter declared, her voice cutting through the heavy tension, "and I guarantee you, heads will roll." As if on cue, several guests who had been recording the entire incident stepped forward, their voices rising in support. "She's right," one man shouted. "You can't treat people like this just because you've a badge." "Let them go," another woman yelled. "They haven't done anything wrong." The growing outcry seemed to shake the last vestiges of control the officers held over the situation. Some of the younger officers, visibly unnerved by the mounting public scrutiny, began to take hesitant steps back. Others exchanged tense, whispered words, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of undeniable evidence and collective resistance. Seeing the shift, James Walker decided to push further. He straightened himself and turned to address the officers directly, his tone sharp and authoritative. "If you want to salvage what's left of your careers," he said, "you'll release everyone here now and walk away. Otherwise, I promise you, every single one of you will be named in the lawsuits that are coming." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. For the first time that night, uncertainty crept into the expressions of even the most defiant officers. It was as though they were beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a noise complaint gone awry. It was an explosive scandal waiting to unfold, with consequences that would reverberate far beyond the backyard. One of the older officers, a man with gray-streaked hair and a weary expression, finally stepped forward. His voice, quiet but steady, betrayed a hint of regret. "This has gone far enough," he said, his eyes scanning the chaos before him. "We need to de-escalate." The lead officer whipped around to face him, his expression incredulous and angry. "De-escalate?" he snapped. "They've been resisting us this whole time." The older officer shook his head firmly. "No," he replied, his tone resolute. "They've been asserting their rights, and we've been ignoring them. We need to back down." His statement lingered in the air like the calm after a storm, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth that had been apparent all along, a truth that could no longer be denied. One by one, the other officers began lowering their weapons and easing their grips on the restrained guests. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. While the tension didn't dissipate entirely, the immediate threat of violence receded. Sophia and James stood together, their hands still bound, but their spirits unbroken. They had revealed themselves not just in terms of their titles and positions, but as individuals who refused to be silenced in the face of gross injustice. They had stood firm against the abuse of power, exposing the arrogance of those who believed they could act with impunity. As the officers began to release the guests, the weight of what had transpired hung heavily in the air. The trauma of the night was etched on every face, from the tear-streaked cheeks of children reunited with their parents to the weary gazes of elders who had borne the brunt of the officers' aggression. The older officer who had called for de-escalation gave a curt nod to his colleagues, signaling them to begin removing the handcuffs. Sophia felt the cold metal finally leave her wrists, and she rubbed her sore arms, relief mingling with a steely resolve. No amount of releasing the guests would undo the damage that had been done. But this was a start. Sophia exchanged a look with James, who was also being freed. The same fierce determination burned in his eyes. They both understood that justice needed to be served, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had suffered that night. The guests, though shaken, began to gather together, checking on one another and offering comfort. Children who had been separated from their parents were held close, their tears gradually subsiding. Though the scene had calmed, it still bore the remnants of chaos and fear. Several guests continued recording, determined to capture every moment as evidence of the night's events. Their phones held the truth, a testament to the injustice they had endured and the courage that had been displayed in standing against it. Sophia stepped forward, her voice steady and commanding as she addressed the officers. "We are not finished here," she said, her tone carrying the weight of a verdict. "Every one of you who participated in this unlawful conduct will face the consequences." The officers stood silent, their faces a mixture of shame, anger, and fear. They had begun to back away, their authority shaken and their actions laid bare for all to see. As the tension began to ease, it was clear that the battle was nearing its end. But for Sophia and James, the fight for justice was only beginning. They knew that the consequences of this night would reach far beyond the backyard, reverberating through the legal system and the court of public opinion. "There will be an investigation," Sophia Carter declared, her voice unwavering, "and your badges will not protect you." The lead officer, who had been the embodiment of hostility throughout the night, tried to salvage his authority. "You people were resisting," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction it carried earlier. "We were just doing our job." James Walker cut in sharply, his tone laced with contempt. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to terrorize innocent people at a private event. You acted on baseless accusations and let your prejudice dictate your actions. That's not law enforcement. It's an abuse of power." The weight of James's words seemed to pierce the officer's defiance. His jaw tightened in frustration as he opened his mouth to respond. But before he could speak, the older officer who had earlier called for de-escalation stepped forward. "It's over," the older officer said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. He cast a somber glance at Sophia and James. "I'm sorry. This never should have happened." The apology hung heavily in the air. It was sincere but inadequate to undo the harm caused. Sophia held the officer's gaze, her expression resolute. "You're right, it shouldn't have," she replied firmly. "And now, there will be consequences." By this time, word of the incident had already begun to spread beyond the confines of the backyard. The recordings taken by guests were quickly going viral, gaining traction on social media platforms. Within hours, the story would dominate headlines, sparking outrage across the nation. The legal ramifications were swift. Backed by their influential families, Sophia and James filed formal complaints against the officers involved. Footage showing blatant misconduct and violations of civil rights became the foundation of a mounting case against the police department. The community, galvanized by the events of the night, rallied around Sophia and James. They demanded justice and accountability, their voices joining a growing chorus calling for change. Investigations were launched at both local and federal levels. With James's connections at the National Investigative Bureau, they ensured that the inquiry would not be swept under the rug. The officers' actions came under intense scrutiny. Their records were examined, revealing troubling patterns. Complaints of excessive force and racial bias had dogged some of them for years. What had started as a fabricated disturbance call was now a full-blown scandal that transcended the boundaries of a single police department. The lead officer, whose aggressive behavior had defined the confrontation, was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. His past was rife with allegations of misconduct, including accusations of excessive force and discriminatory behavior, casting a dark shadow over his career. Several of the other officers involved faced suspension as their actions were dissected under the glaring lens of public scrutiny. Meanwhile, the story of Sophia and James's wedding-turned-nightmare resonated with people across the nation. It ignited discussions about systemic injustice, police reform, and racial bias within law enforcement. Sophia and James found themselves at the center of a burgeoning movement, one aimed at addressing the very systems that had enabled such abuse of power to persist. In the weeks that followed, the legal process began to unfold. With a team of dedicated attorneys, Sophia and James prepared to take their case to court. Their mission was clear: not only to seek justice for the harm inflicted upon them and their guests, but to set a precedent that would deter future misconduct. The courtroom became a battleground for the truth. Witnesses from the wedding testified, recounting the terror they had endured and the excessive force used by the officers. Footage from the night played a central role, showing the indiscriminate aggression toward unarmed civilians, including children and the elderly. The evidence left little room for the defense to argue justification. The recordings vividly captured the overreach, the fear, and the unnecessary escalation that had marred the celebration. Sophia's and James's resolve remained unshaken as they worked tirelessly alongside their legal team. They understood the weight of what they were fighting for: justice for their family and friends, accountability for those who had abused their authority, and a broader fight against the systemic flaws that allowed such behavior to persist. As the case progressed, it became a symbol of resistance and reform, drawing attention from civil rights organizations and community leaders alike. The couple's courage in standing up to injustice inspired many, becoming a rallying cry for change. Sophia and James were no longer just fighting for themselves. Their battle had become one of national significance, a movement challenging the misuse of power and demanding a fairer, more just system for all. The evidence presented during the trial left little room for the defense to argue that the officers' actions were justified. Sophia Carter took the stand, not only as a victim, but as a legal expert. With the authority of her position as a judge, she detailed the multitude of legal violations committed that night and the lasting impact on everyone present. Her testimony was powerful. a judge who had personally experienced the abuse of power, now using her voice to condemn it with clarity and conviction. James Walker followed her, his testimony underscoring the systemic failures that had led to the incident. Drawing on his extensive background as a senior agent with the National Investigative Bureau, he outlined the proper procedures the officers should have followed, and how their actions grossly deviated from those standards at every turn. His words carried the weight of someone who had dedicated his life to law enforcement, someone who deeply understood the meaning of integrity and accountability. The trial drew national attention. Civil rights organizations and community leaders rallied behind Sophia and James, recognizing their case as emblematic of a much larger struggle. The courtroom became a symbol of resistance against systemic injustice, uniting people in a shared call for meaningful reform. Ultimately, the jury ruled in favor of Sophia and James. The court determined that the officers had violated the couple's civil rights and acted with excessive force and racial bias. The police department was ordered to pay substantial damages, and several officers faced disciplinary action, including termination and potential criminal charges. The lead officer, who had been the face of hostility throughout the ordeal, was charged with gross misconduct. His long history of excessive force and racial prejudice came to light during the proceedings, ensuring that his law enforcement career ended in disgrace. As the verdict was delivered, Sophia and James stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by supporters and media. The journey to this moment had been grueling, filled with challenges that tested their strength and resolve. But they had emerged victorious, not only for themselves, but for every person who had ever been unjustly targeted or silenced. Sophia addressed the crowd gathered before them, her voice steady and resolute. "Tonight, we proved that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to enforce it," she declared. "This fight wasn't just for us, but for everyone who has been mistreated, ignored, or silenced. And let me be clear, this is only the beginning." James stood beside her, his arm wrapped around her shoulders as they faced the cameras and the crowd. The ordeal had solidified their bond and their commitment to the cause they now championed. Their fight was far from over, but this victory marked a significant step in the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. As they walked away from the courthouse hand in hand, Sophia and James felt the weight of what they had accomplished. Their story had become a beacon of hope, inspiring others to stand against injustice and demand accountability. The chapter concluded with a sense of triumph and renewed determination. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. And as Sophia and James moved ahead, they carried the knowledge that their courage had helped spark real change. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed it and want to hear more, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos. Give us a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We value your opinion. And don't forget to explore the other stories on our channel. See you next time.